All right, so we are going to look at the rest of content area 10. Good. So we left off just finishing talking about Shir Nishat. And so now we're going to look again at Pepon Osorio. I love him and his work. Just as a reminder, we're looking at another installation that this is an immersive experience that was in Connecticut in 1994. It was installed as a kind of walk through experience exhibit at a structure he transformed into a barbershop. No Crying Aloud in the Barbershop, Pepon Osorio, 1994. He's dealing with, again, kind of the same thing we saw with Shir Nishat, contradictions, right? He's dealing with what it means to be a Puerto Rican, New Yorkan, right? So Puerto Rican and from New York. He's dealing with ideas and pressures of masculinity, specifically within the Latino culture. And that idea of machismo. He's dealing with contradictions between just even what society as a whole considers masculine versus feminine. Crying, of course, being something that traditionally is more associated with the female, and then barbershop being something that is more traditionally associated with the male. I promise I'm not smoking. I've got incense going around me. It looks like I'm like in a glove. All right. So large scale installations. I think we talked about all of this. I know we did. Now, components of the piece can travel, right? And so we can see elements of it on display different places, but the entire installation as a space was specific for a neighborhood of Puerto Ricans in Connecticut. So this is going to be more both his work and Shir Nishat's work. Both of them have never been on the AP exam, okay? But both of their work is personal, right? Whereas when we talk about Jeff Koons, we're talking about, or he's talking about societal issues. But with Shir Nishat and with Pepon Osorio, they're talking about personal issues. They're talking about things related specifically to their experience. He also, like Jeff Koons, deals with the idea of kitsch. And so throughout the site, there's different videos of, it's kind of a back and forth, men crying and then men doing things perceived by society as masculine, like wrestling or snake handling or boxing, fighting, physical altercation, whatever, like the matador, you know, like tempting a bull, that kind of things. Pisupo, we talked about corned beef just a minute because this was a piece I gave y'all to do on your own. It has already been on the AP exam. This is Pacific Contemporary. Okay, so this is dealing with this idea of post-contact. You have these cultures who before contact with the Europeans had quite healthy diets, and you know, we're eating fish and local vegetables and more lean protein. And then once there's contact with these European groups, you start to have this reliance on canned goods, and they just called all canned goods pea soup, right? This is where we get pea soupo. Even though, again, like we call all, maybe not all of us, but a lot of people call all facial tissues Kleenex, right? Because we're kind of generic by a type or a brand. And so he is thinking about that, but even though it's bad for them health-wise, and it is not a indigenous food, corned beef, this canned beef product, has become something that represents a kind of culture of gift giving within his Rarotongan family, his Samoan family, here in the Pacific Islands. And so there's this nostalgia to it, right? Even if it's not good for you, even if it's not maybe super delicious for everybody, it takes on this kind of nostalgic connection. And there's something similar that happens in Hawaii with Spam, right? Very similar product, similar area. And so it can become kind of a complicated relationship between a food and a culture, and what is traditional to that culture versus what is results of convergence with the West. So he makes the bull. Remember, he like has these like bulls, like he even made them to where they would like fight each other. So dealing with that masculine idea as well. All right, Nam June Pak was the first video artist we talked about. And so this is his installation called Electronic Superhighway, which is kind of a mix between an installation and a sculpture. So Nam June Pak is first, and then we know that he influences Bill Viola in his work. All right, so Pak believed that in the 70s, he really believed that there was going to be this, and a lot of people predicted this, and of course it's true, that there's this new quick evolution of digital media, of technology, specifically relating to communication, the way that ideas are spread, how it's going to affect things like pollution and segregation and modernization. And as soon as, people in America can easily see footage of what's happening in, Japan or in Australia, there is a breaking down of those barriers, because we have this new media, this new insight into other areas. And so he's, even with this piece, he's really just thinking about across America, but then even how America is communicating with the world, right, globally. So the electronic superhighway is the internet, the World Wide Web. So this is, it kind of blends into performance, although it's not an individual performing, it is the television performance idea. Remember, each of these televisions has some stereotypical, according to the artist, footage playing within the shape of that state. I love Idaho over here. It's just like potatoes. So it's pretty funny. So 40-foot long, 15-foot high. It is this large neon and video edifice. He talks about information overload and how, even as Americans, or as just contemporary people, we are certainly overwhelmed by video and audio noise, right? And then he's also having us deal with this idea that it can become a trance, right? We can get sucked into the screen and we can be kind of trapped there. And this is even before, the iPhone. And so really he's dealing with this predominance towards screens that we see very, very, starting really prominently around the 1940s, 50s, and then through today. Right? So screens look different through this time, but we see this emphasis. And then linking that to Zen Buddhism as this idea that as you stand and watch or look at this piece, you are slowing down, right? You are in some form meditating, even that if that meditation is not necessarily spiritual, you're slowed down and you're zoned in to the screen. All right, The Crossing by Bill Viola. So The Crossing is really dealing with this liminal space between life and death. This idea of different types of destruction. And this can go spiritual, and it certainly does in a lot of his works, where you see this reminder of damage of natural forces like water and fire. He talks about his own personal experience that was a near drowning experience. But we also see this as these as universal experiences, right? This idea of a baptism, a transformation, a self-annihilation, these points of change and transformation that at some form or another cultures all around the world experience and deal with and have ideas about. As you watch his work, remember, he slows things down. So as you watch his work, you are transfixed. You become a participator in this meditation, right? So he's asking you to do that. Now, remember, this is one side is the water, one side is the fire. The water comes from the top and drips down. The fire starts at the bottom and goes up. And it's set up in a room installation. So it's in the middle, then you have something on either side. Slowing down makes it to where we just really experience every little millisecond, right? So 300 frames per second. Again, links to Zen Buddhism. Some different religious symbolism, as I mentioned. And then, of course, he's influenced by Pak. So fire, water, these things can be destructive, even like we talked about with, hold on. So I'm responding to a text. We talked about Shiva and the fire, right? And the Shiva is the Lord of the dance, and this idea that destruction isn't necessarily a bad thing. It can provide space for something new. All right, so the Guggenheim in Spain, this is a structure that is just so over the top. Remember that it was constructed as this titanium kind of fragmented, almost ship form that has components that are at once organic and geometric. Gehry is our artist, Frank Gehry. He's an American who has done a lot of kind of iconic buildings. And the context of this piece, remember that the Guggenheim was looking for some satellite structures, because the Guggenheim that Frank Lloyd Wright built, the structure that he built in Central Park or off Central Park on the Upper East Side, New York, is just not a great space for actually showing art. Now, it's a cool building, but it doesn't really function great as a museum. But remember, with Falling Water House, right, by Frank Lloyd Wright, he's not really that concerned about function. He's mostly concerned about aesthetics and how it relates to the surrounding environment and getting the sense of the space. And so he doesn't care. So Gehry was asked to make this satellite museum at the Guggenheim, and this has been the most successful of the Guggenheim satellite museums. So it's using the collection of this family, but it's kind of spreading them out around the world. Part of the purpose of this structure was to help rejuvenate this region in Spain and really get there to be more visitors, more tourism, and all of that affecting the travel income, right? But bumping up the economic development of this space. And so he designed it specifically to be right on the water. And so it does have kind of this nautical feel to it. Remember that titanium, incredibly expensive. It's a new material when it comes to architecture here. It's not typical because of how expensive it is, but this was just kind of like throwing everything in and seeing what works. If we think about this building as a change, right? As a change, a space that has differed. The majority of museums and libraries, the older traditional libraries, university buildings are done in this neoclassical style that's looking back to Greece and Rome as the foundation of democracy, as the foundation of, the academic and reason and order. And so it's not until the 20th century that we start to have museums as artistic spaces. And again, a great example is the Perot in Dallas. And it has this postmodern, expressive, deconstructivist look to it. Now, it's not as deconstructed looking as this structure, right? But you have exposed beams, you have the big panels of glass, you have this kind of turn of the cube. And so it takes on some of those elements of that we saw all the way back to Cubism, deconstructing an object. So there is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water, which was made to challenge those neoclassical assumptions that we have up to this point, like the Metropolitan, right, which is just down the way, still on the Upper East Side in New York, and that emphasis on columns and the pediment and ionic friezes, and it has all of this, traditionalism. And so he was trying to do something new. So very few straight edges or right angles. Has the scales look on the exterior. The galleries that are, the display spaces that are more rectilinear are where the more traditional work is. The ones that are a little bit more organic or odd shaped are the ones where the more contemporary work is. Both architects give us this sense of force and dynamic movement with their work, right? With Frank Lloyd Wright, we see the spin, right? This kind of spinning as an emphasis. But with Gehry, you kind of see this breaking apart. In some ways, looking from above, it almost looks like a flower opening up, right? So we have this dynamic movement. And he says he was inspired by the Baroque, right? Which makes sense if you think about the irregularity of shapes, juxtaposition. And it worked. It was very, very impactful in the local economy. The tax base grew, and the city, the whole region benefited. So it was very successful. Okay, Pure Land by Mariko Mori. So this was kind of our first look at Photoshop, right? The idea of Photoshop. And so this is from a series called The Esoteric Cosmos. And it was part of an installation about Nirvana, right? The state of being of Nirvana, not the band, just in case you're curious. So we have this like cyber geisha, that is Mariko Mori, the artist herself. We have these musical robot beings flying around, the lotus representing wisdom, Buddha's kind of throne. We have what looks otherworldly in the same way that Spiral Jetty was built in a space that looked otherworldly, right? Because of how saltwater works. We have the Dead Sea, sunrise at the Dead Sea, and notice how our figure, our cyber geisha, Mariko Mori, who's also representing an ancient Japanese goddess, is right on our horizon. And then in the back right, we have a stupa. So she's really in that, as someone pointed out, liminal space, but this liminal space between fantasy and reality, right? Because we know that this is an actual photograph, the scene in the background. And we know that she's a real person, right? That's a photograph, but the way it is juxtaposed together feels otherworldly. So fantasy and reality coming together. Remember that this was part of a experience called Nirvana, where you would go into a space and you would see the video playing, which this is a shot from the video. You would see this image printed on glass, and then there would be this floral scented fan blowing air on you. And so, and she was humming. It was a recording of her humming some kind of a mixture between kind of a chant, but then also some Japanese folk, or not folk, pop music. And so it's this immersive experience. And I just would really suggest you watch those videos, and you'll get a feel. You'll get a feel for her work. This idea of salt, right? Salt water, this being a space for rejuvenation, rebirth, purification. Talked about the stupa. Ideas of Buddha. All right, Lying with a Wolf. Lying with a Wolf by Kiki Smith is a drawing on paper, but it's lots of pieces of paper kind of pasted together to make a large sheet of paper. As I mentioned when we first started talking about global contemporary, there's going to be this idea that the audience can respond different ways, right? And so she wants there to be that open-ended response, but she's asking us to really consider myths, and religious stories, relationships between humans and animals, relationships of women, right, or identities of women, and the female form and all that can be confounded into that. Likely this piece is about Saint Genevieve. Saint Genevieve is the patron saint of Paris, and she was related to the wolf. The wolf. She brings some imagery from her Catholic upbringing into her work. Obviously, Saint Genevieve would be part of that. In a similar way to Aberconowitz, she thinks with Aberconowitz does the androgyny 3, she's thinking about a way that the body, the human body, can be a receptacle or a representation of something else, right? Life experiences, certainly, but also the past, right? These stories from the past, myths, mystics, narratives from the past, traditions. Typically, when we see the female body, it is often sexualized or presented in an erotic way. And so that can be read a little bit into here, but I mean, again, this is a pretty rudimentary line drawing. Husband's being loud. It was part of a series exploring women's relationships with animals, but again, we know it goes deeper than that. Typically, we wouldn't suggest someone taking all their clothes off and cuddling with a wolf, right? It's going to probably look a little strange. It's going to be dangerous. But here is this sense of almost a reciprocal comforting between the two beings. Instead of being predator and prey, right? We're seeing them as similar scale. We're seeing them as comparable objects to each other. Okay, Darktown Rebellion. Just such a tough piece. So again, I don't think this will be on the AP exam. It has already been an FRQ. But in this work, Kara Walker is asking us to consider how history is generally taught and depicted, and the preconceived ideas about not only slaves, but also people of color in general, and people who are enslaved or people of color. And then also what plantation owners did and the kinds of things that that they were known for. But she does it in this way that feels and is so traditionally Victorian, as these cut out silhouettes. And then she splashes across them these bright colored lights. And so it feels like it could be playful. It feels like it could be Peter Pan. But in reality, it represents horrors of rape and murder and dehumanization, and it's dark. It's very, very dark. Even the title, Darky Town Rebellion, is a phrase we do not use to refer to a group of people or a group of neighborhood, right? And so this is a tough work, but again, I don't think it'll be on the exam because it has already been. But I would suggest you look through it, read about it. One interesting thing about it is the fact, another interesting thing about it is the fact that as you walk between the projector and the work on the wall, you become one of these silhouettes, right? And so she's immersing you in this work. It's that idea of a rebellion. We see violence. We see an uprising. We see people treated like animals, dehumanization, nightmarish, right? Nightmarish scenes. Silhouettes simplify it for us, much more so than, a full color rendering would. She's reflecting on how African Americans have been depicted throughout history and shown. And being an African American, she has insight into that. Similar to Faith Ringgold, similar to Jean-Michel Basquiat with horn players. How do these, I think it's interesting. So through Darkytown Rebellion, Walker is not attempting to correct the past, but to say, are these merely images from the past, or do these caricatures still resonate in the 21st century? Choosing silhouettes is interesting because, again, silhouettes are generally a art form of white European or American aristocracy, right? Usually women and children, and they typically are something that's kind of a collector, a nostalgia. And here she's using them to show something dark. And so it's an interesting approach for her media. So black cutouts, Kara Walker. The swing after Fragonard, I know that, again, this has already been on the exam and we've talked about it, or you guys were supposed to do it as your own, but remember this is dealing with the idea of appropriation, and he's being very upfront about it, right? He's saying in this work, this is the swing after Fragonard, right? There's no question like what he's doing here, that line he's making. So he's made a 3D installation of a painting, right? And as someone who is West African and British, he has this interesting take on colonizing and the types of or the effects it has on generations, right? And so he's dealing with some of that. He's using the Dutch wax fabric, which has become stereotypical of a lot of West African clothing. So it has kind of a complicated past as well. Both Fragonard and Shonabare, our artists here, are commenting on contemporary society, right? You can walk around this. You can take on different viewpoints. He calls himself a post-colonial hybrid. His works often lack heads, and we can see that as a reference to the guillotine, definitely. The African Dutch wax fabric has this complicated past because the designs were based out of Indonesia. Okay, the actual patterns themselves, these prints based out of Indonesia, but the fabric was made in England and Holland. Okay. When they copied it, it sold well in Indonesia. It did not sell well in Europe. And so the Europeans started selling it to West African colonies, and there it became part of their visual aesthetic. And so this complicated fabric that was initially kind of a throw off, like no one else will buy this, so y'all use it, is now a pride, right, in these West African countries. It's something that is really special and an identifier for them. And so that it's just interesting to see how that happens over time. And then he talks about how both in the painting and in this piece, leisure, right? And how leisure oftentimes is depicted as the result of exploitation of someone else. And so when we see, a plantation owner kicked back drinking some tea, he's not the one doing the work, right? And so this idea of what systems are in place, and I'm not talking about leisure that is the result of hard work. I'm talking about leisure that is the result of others' hard work. Okay. Other of his pieces. All right, El Natsui. Remember, he is the one who does the kind of piece together, almost like a quilt, but metal, of caps, right? Of bottle caps. And so like my Coke Zero here, this has a plastic cap. But if this was a glass bottle, right? Usually they have metal. And so what he does is he cuts this so that he ends up with the strip that is the kind of vertical part. And then he ends up with the circle that is the flat base. And then he pieces these together, and he doesn't do it all himself. He has assistants who help him in this. Now, the artist is also bringing to the fact this idea of this idea of libation, right? Libation. And so whenever the Africans, whenever they open a bottle of alcohol, right, before they serve it, they pour a little out on the ground. And so this offering, this pouring out, is seen as ancestral pride and remembrance. And so each one of these caps that has become this quilt, right, is the result of or has participated in a libation, this process. And so there's something important about this act as these pieces are stitched together. And then we can question, is this two-dimensional or three-dimensional? Is this a sculpture? Is it a wall hanging? And then there's been some questions about how to display this work. Is it, should it be with contemporary work? Should it be with African work? And so the Metropolitan, for example, owns two of these. One they hang with the African work, one they hang with the contemporaries. Stadia is a work that is really about places. It's really about sites. This was put together by her taking and tracing these different site plans, elevations, perspectives, and designs of stadiums and field houses and, Olympic match areas, opera houses, theaters, ancient temples, putting all these gathering spaces together, layering them up. And then she does these bold and bright colors using kind of a flat acrylic and ink. And so she lets this layering up kind of gives us a sense of the chaos of that space, but at the same time, it also feels controlled, right? We look at the wedge-shaped seating, the same type of thing that the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks used, that we still use in our concert halls. And we see that as a way to control. So this has that chaos and control kind of coming together. It was part of a triptych that was Stadia 1, 2, and 3. And so we got piece 2 right in the middle. These are large scale pieces. Thinking about all the sounds and smells and sights within one of these spaces. And then we can also see this as relating, I would say, not only to Wassily Kandinsky and Der blaue Reiter, German Expressionism, but also linking us to De Stijl, Piet Mondrian, 1930, where he is reducing shapes and images and ideas, mathematical equations down to their most restrictive, most spare forms. And then he was giving us this sense of a universal language, right? So she's kind of almost playing with that idea of a universal language. It can represent the sterility and the control and organization of a space while also representing the chaos and disorder of a space. So the piece up there on the left, remember, this is Improvisation 28, Kandinsky. Now, I've already recorded lectures for Praying Mantra and shared them with you. Shibboleth. And Zaha Hadid's Maxi. So the last piece that we covered in class was Sunflower Seeds by Ai Weiwei. This was an installation at the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. Remember that they have asked an artist every year to come and do an installation at this site. Shibboleth was a, Shibboleth went in and did the crack into the ground, whereas Sunflower Seeds, Ai Weiwei, he went in and added on top. Okay, so what has he done here? These are 100 million life-size, handmade, hand-painted porcelain sunflower seeds. So we would call this hyper-realism. Sunflower seeds have a complicated relationship with China, and we can look at it as propagandistic with Chairman Mao, and we will. We can also look at it as a staple food. And then this is, this part of China is the porcelain capital of the world. It's a site where he is able to employ hundreds of people to help him make these porcelain seeds. And so he's also able to give some economic justice to the area. So if we think about this idea of Mao and what he did, remember that so often, from the Incans to the pharaohs to King Louis XIV, we have kings call themselves sons or link themselves with the sun. So Mao absolutely linked himself with the sun. And we have this idea of the sunflower, right? The sunflower turns its head and faces the sun as it moves across the sky. And so you have this following, this allegiance of people. So one of the things that he's doing here, of all these little seeds, is by pulling these out, Rich, which I know you all know this, but the sunflower seeds are in the middle of the sunflower, right? So he's taking these and he's freeing them from the binds that hold them to this fascist regime, right? He's freeing them from their base as beholden to this communist leader. So by dumping them all out on the floor, right, he's reminding of this camaraderie of the Chinese people. He's reminding of the power of the Chinese people. Weiwei is super controversial in China. He gets thrown in jail. He gets his passport taken away because he refuses to stop speaking out against some of the harm of these socialist regimes, and then also and communism, but also artistic freedom, right? And so he does a lot of work that is dealing with social issues. When this show first opened, you could walk on it, and then they realized that was hurting people's lungs, so they closed it up. Porcelain, of course, these are porcelain, which is such an important material in China, both traditionally and contemporary. So there's a picture from the factory. All right, that is it. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this content area 10. See ya.